Stanford University.
The following podcast is one of 6 sessions recorded at the Legal Frontiers in Digital Media Conference at Stanford University, May 6 and 7, 2010. This conference was produced by the Media Law Resource Center, Stanford Law School's Center for Internet and Society, and the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships at Stanford University. This session is Banners, Beacons, and Behavioral Targeting, Internet Advertising Technology and Business Models. The moderator is John Hart, partner, Dow Lonis.
I have moderated a lot of panels over the years, and I don't think I've ever been more excited than I am about this one. Our keynote speaker, Alyssa Cooper, who I'll introduce in just a minute, is going to open by explaining the technology that underlies advertising on the internet and the data collection that accompanies that advertising. Then we're going to have a panel of industry experts, who I'll introduce later when they come up here, and they're going to help us understand how advertising is bought and sold on the internet, who the various players in that ecosystem are, why they need each other, why there's tension among them, who's collecting data, where they're collecting it, what they're doing with it, why media companies aren't making as much money as all of us wish they were, and what they're doing about it. Then we're going to bring up some leading experts on internet privacy law, who are going to explain the legal consequences of what Alyssa and the other panelists have talked about. You can count on, among other things, an update on the draft privacy bill that Chairman Boucher and Representative Stearns released for discussion on Tuesday. So let me tell you about our keynote speaker. Alyssa Cooper is a Stanford-educated computer scientist and an expert in explaining complicated technology to laymen and to helping us understand why it matters. As chief computer scientist for the Center of Democracy and Technology, Alyssa's testified before Congress and the FTC, and she's currently in a PhD program while being chief computer scientist for the CDT. She's in a PhD program at the Internet Institute at Oxford University. And before she starts, and I promise you, I've seen Alyssa speak before, you're going to want to applaud when she's done, but I'd like to join me in thanking Alyssa for crossing 8 time zones to talk to us today. Alyssa?
Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to John for inviting me, and to all of the sponsors and organizers of this conference. I did recently relocate to the United Kingdom, and over there they talk a lot about privacy, they talk a lot about adverts, and so it's always nice to have an opportunity to come back to a place where it sounds a little bit more familiar, and these concepts are a little bit closer to my heart, at least when they hit my ear. So, as John said, I studied computer science here at Stanford, and since then have been more focused on the policy issues. I am the chief computer scientist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit public policy organization headquartered in Washington. And what I like to do in my work on privacy and other internet policy issues is to take a little bit more of a technical bent. I really like to pick technology apart and try to understand how it works in order to try and understand what the implications are for public policy. And what I'm going to try to do today is to engage in that process with all of you. So hopefully by the end of the day, we'll all have a little bit of a better understanding of how internet advertising technology works and what some of the implications are. Because of my work at CDT, I have more of a consumer perspective. I think about these things from the vantage point of your average internet user. And because of that, I don't think as much about the business and the back end. And my fellow panelists who are going to come up after me are going to tackle some of those issues. Because I've been working on privacy, the frame that I like to use is to think about the inputs to digital advertising. What data is going in order to serve that ad when you go to the page? And today I'm going to break it down into 2 different kinds of inputs. The first input is just web surfing data. There's lots and lots of data that gets generated just from going and reading the news online, surfing from page to page. So that's the topic that's going to comprise the majority of the talk today. And then the second topic is other kinds of data. There's some new emerging internet advertising models that are involving other different kinds of data about people and what they do online. And I'm going to try to touch on and preview a few of those for you. I'm not going to cover every detail, but just going to try to examine how the technology is working and how data is collected, shared, used, and stored to facilitate internet advertising. So web surfing data. I should say up front that all the examples that I'm going to give today are mostly real. They might have little flourishes of data that I made up, websites that I made up, that sort of thing, and that just helps me stay out of trouble, more or less, but also to create examples that are really compelling so that everyone can understand. So we're going to start talking a little bit about basic web surfing. And the first example for this set is going to be a visit that I made to thehill.com, one of my local papers in DC. So when we visit a page like thehill.com, we think that it's a page. It looks like a single entity. You're just going to read the news. But as it turns out, a single web page is actually comprised of many, many different pieces. And those pieces can come from all over the place. You can have all different kinds of content, some of it being served by The Hill, and some of it being served by what are usually called third parties. So in this case, thehill.com would be the first party, and that's the URL, if you could see it, written in the URL bar. That's what we're going to call the first party. And content that comes from anywhere else, those are all called third parties. So in this example, you might have some analytics or some measurement that's happening delivered by a third party. You might have an ad delivered by an ad network. There might be a style sheet on the page, so a piece of code that helps to lay out the page so it looks a certain way. You might have images that come from some third-party server, and you might have another ad that comes from yet another third party. So even if you have multiple ads on the same page, they're not all necessarily going to come from the same place. And as it turns out, those third parties all have their own servers that they're serving content from. So whereas the content that The Hill serves would come from a place like thehill.com, you might have analytics coming from web trends. Your ad network might be DoubleClick. Your ad server might be the Atlas server from Microsoft. Your style sheet could come from someplace like WordPress. Your images could come from PhotoBucket. And all of those different names, all of those different domain names are third-party servers. So you have all this content coming from many places, delivered in one place into the user's web browser. If we look a little bit deeper at what actually happens when someone visits thehill.com, this is actually a log of one of my visits to thehill.com. And what you see here is actually my browser communicating with all of these different servers and asking all of these servers, hey, I need this piece of data, I need this piece of data. And you can see there's a bunch of those calls that go directly to servers hosted by The Hill, or you see ad.thehill.com. All of those are coming from the first party, from thehill.com. But you also see lots of different content coming from third parties. So you see some coming from DoubleClick. There's a pixel that's being served by QuantServe. We're going to talk about pixels in a little bit. There's something from CM Core. I don't even know what CM Core is necessarily. There's some video being delivered by Brightcove. So you can see all of these different third-party calls intermingled with calls to the first party. And I should say, just one note while we're looking at this, you see that all of these are prefaced with http://. We're all very familiar with this from typing it into our URL bars. HTTP is just the language of the web. It's the language that my browser uses to talk to all of these various servers and that they use to talk back to me. And we're going to come back to that again in a little bit when we talk about some of the new models and the language that they use. So that's basic web surfing. You go to one page, you get content from lots of places. There's some other web technologies that are really important for advertising. And I want to talk a little bit about JavaScript, cookies, and pixels, because we talk about them all the time. They're actually pretty simple concepts, but they're important to understand how they work. So let's go back to our example of thehill.com and our little user guy who's running on his laptop. So when the user goes to thehill.com, his browser says, hey, I want to read your page. And what thehill.com sends back is a page which has content that it's serving on the page. But there's some stuff missing. There's those spots where the ads go. There's various pieces that aren't quite there yet. And the way that those pieces arrive is by thehill.com, in addition to sending back the content, will also send back a little piece of JavaScript. And that's what you see actually on the screen there. JavaScript is it's like software that runs inside your browser. It's a little set of instructions that says, hey, do this or that, and your browser can follow those instructions. So in this case, this JavaScript says to the user's browser, you need to go to doubleclick.net in order to get this ad that needs to be served on the page. So that JavaScript hits the user's browser. The browser says, okay, I can go to doubleclick.net. User's browser goes to doubleclick.net, and DoubleClick serves back the ad that eventually ends up in the top banner of the page. And what's important to note about this setup is that there's not necessarily any communication between thehill.com and doubleclick.net. Everything is going through the user's browser. So I go to the Hill and it says go to DoubleClick, and the browser goes to DoubleClick independently. There could be some communication there, but in lots of instances, there's none. To make this a little bit more real, let's throw in a cookie. And I apologize that it's not really rendering that well, but hopefully people can get the gist of it. So cookies are little pieces of data that get stored in your browser. Pretty straightforward. It's just like any other file sitting on your computer. Cookies are just files that sit on your computer. And let's say I go to thehill.com. It sends me over to DoubleClick. If I go to doubleclick.net and I've never had a cookie from DoubleClick before, then what I'll get back is this instruction that you see at the bottom of the page that says to my browser, okay, you need to keep this cookie on your machine, and we're going to set it to this particular value. And cookies can be used for lots of different things. They're the mechanism that allow us to have e-commerce, so that when you move from one page to the next as you're checking out in a shopping cart, it can remember which goods you put in the shopping cart. In the advertising world, what they're really, really important for is keeping track of individual users, whether it's for counting clicks or developing user profiles. Cookies are the technology that allow you to say, every time I come back to a page, oh, that's Alyssa, she's back here again at thehill.com. And that's because that ID that you see at the bottom is a unique identifier that has been assigned to my browser and my browser only. The more common case is that I actually already have a DoubleClick cookie because I've been to a site where DoubleClick served a cookie before. And so this is what the interaction actually probably looks like most of the time. I go to the Hill says you need to go to DoubleClick, and then when I go to DoubleClick, when my browser goes and asks DoubleClick for the ad, it actually sends the cookie right away. So DoubleClick gets the cookie and it says, oh, this is ID number 228, whatever, 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 and it remembers that I'm the same person who's been to all those other sites where DoubleClick has seen me. I should say that cookies are domain specific. So if DoubleClick sets a cookie in my browser, it can't be read from any other website or from any other third party. So thehill.com can't read my DoubleClick cookie. No other third party, no other first party can read DoubleClick's cookies. Only DoubleClick can read them. The other important thing about the cookies that are used for advertising is that they're a little bit more stable in terms of how they can identify someone than the other kinds of identifiers that already get sent when people are surfing the web. So you see in this example, our user who's running on his laptop now has an IP address showing. It's so 192.76.30.98. That's the address of his computer on the internet. And every time he goes to a website, that IP address gets sent. Every time one of these third-party calls gets made, that IP address gets sent. And so you might wonder, well, why don't we just use IP addresses to keep track of people as they surf from page to page instead of having to go through, jump all these hoops with cookies? And as it turns out, IP addresses can change over time. So some internet service providers will assign an IP address and they'll refresh it now and again so that the same user over time has different IP addresses. And that's why cookies are so important, because cookies can last beyond those changes. So even if your IP address changes over time, that cookie will stay the same. Now, users have the ability to delete cookies, but some of them do, some of them don't. And no matter what, the cookie ID that you have can last at least until the user deletes it, and certainly across time periods when an IP address can change. And that's why cookies are so important for internet advertising. The other important thing about this model is that because DoubleClick is a third party, it can be serving content on lots and lots of different pages. And yet every time the same user goes to any of those pages, DoubleClick can read its cookie. So when I go to The Hill, and then I go to the Washington Post, and then I go to USA Today, those three first parties, The Hill, Washington Post, USA Today, they don't each know that I went to the other site. But if DoubleClick or any other third party is serving an ad or serving content on all three of those sites, it will know that my browser went to all of those sites. And the mechanism that allows it to do that is the cookie. So it's the facilitator of that correlation of behavior across lots and lots of different sites. So one note about pixels. You hear about pixels a lot, and now it's actually a verb now, getting pixeled. This happens to some pages. So this is back from the first example of thehill.com. I had this, this analytics with the arrow, right? So pixels are often used for analytics. They're used for lots of different things. And what they are is actually nothing. They're called pixels because they are invisible images, literally a 1 pixel image on a page. So why would you want to put something that's invisible on the page that no one can actually see, and it's only 1 pixel big? Well, just like all of those other server calls that we were looking at before, when a first party or a third party sets a pixel on a page, it forces your browser to go and get that image, because it's just a little image, even though you can't see it. And what that means is that the third party will know that you went to the page, because your browser has to go and ask for the pixel. So it's really a mechanism for checking in, so that the third party can know, oh, this browser was at this page, or yes, this ad was shown, or yes, this content was served. The other thing that's useful about pixels is that they can be used to set cookies. They're just like all those other server calls that we were looking at before, just the same way that cookies are going back and forth when we're asking for ads or asking for other content. When you ask for a pixel, the third party or the first party can send a cookie back along with that pixel. And so they're often used as a means just to set a cookie on a page where a third party isn't serving any other content. So if you're not the ad server or you're not the ad network, but you still want to keep track of who's coming to the page, you can set a pixel in order to do that. So that's a little bit of basics about JavaScript, cookies, and pixels. I want to talk a little bit about the different types of ad targeting. And there's lots and lots of different types. Some people will have more categories than I have, but I think these are really the basic ones that are most important and are kind of leading into some of the newer practices that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So the first one, and I love this example so much. This is actually a little dated at this point, but it's my brother's MySpace page. He's a musician. And I believe I surfed to this page last June and was served this ad about what I should be for Halloween. So it was June. Wasn't really thinking too much about Halloween. I'm also an adult, and I don't really get dressed up for Halloween anymore. And the ad is not really relevant to the page. The page is kind of about music, it's about pop culture, it's about LA, it's not about Halloween. So this is what I would call an untargeted ad. It's not targeted at anything. It's not targeted at me, the user. It's not targeted at the page. It's not really targeted. I think in a little bit, the next panel might talk a little bit about remnant inventory. This might have been a case of remnant inventory, not really sure. But in any case, this ad, it's just not targeted. It's just an ad. The next example is contextual targeting. So in this case, this is the travel page of the Washington Post. And the ads that you get are travel ads. It's ads to go to Sandals. So in this case, the content of the ads is targeted to the content of the page. The page and the ads are roughly about the same thing. They're not targeted to the person, right? They're not targeted to me because I'm looking at this page. They're just pretty much in line with what the content of the page actually is. So that's contextual targeting. The next one is geographic targeting. So I live in the UK. I surfed over to cnet.com, and I actually got served the Dell ad with the price in pounds. This is a UK Dell ad. And as it turns out, that IP address that we were looking at before can be used to correlate to the user's location. IP addresses are assigned such that they're basically correlating to metro area level location. So you can find out, the city that I live in. It kind of depends on what your IP address is as to the level of granularity, but you can know roughly the general location of your user. And so a lot of times you'll see ads that are targeted by metro area, and this is a case of that. And finally, we have a behaviorally targeted ad. So in this case, let's imagine that there's a third party that served this Vegas ad that you see in the corner. And that third party set a cookie on my machine a long time ago, and I go to various sites and I'm surfing around, and that third party is able to collect information about me. As it turns out, I do a lot of traveling, so the third party, as it's collecting this information about me, is seeing, oh, okay, I'm looking at sites that are interested in, economy flights. I'm looking at sites that are leaving, flights that are leaving from the UK, and then most recently, I'm looking at flights to Nevada, flights to Las Vegas. All of this information is getting collected as I'm surfing around the web, and it's being correlated to my cookie ID that you can see in the box. Then, when I hit the Wall Street Journal site, this third party is in charge of targeting the ad, and it says, oh, I get this cookie. Let me look up this profile. This person's profile says she's interested in flying to Las Vegas. Just yesterday she was looking up flights. Why don't we serve her this ad for the MGM Grand? So that's behavioral targeting. You move from site to site. The third party keeps track of various things that you're doing online, builds a profile about you that gets associated with your cookie ID, and then when it comes time to serve you an ad, serves the ad based on past behavior. So this ad is not targeted to the page, right? This page, it's the world news page. It doesn't really have a lot of context, right? The travel page, at least, you could target to travel, right? But for the world news page, there's not a lot of context to target to. So if you want to do something a little bit more sophisticated than geographic targeting, you can do behavioral targeting based on all the places that I've surfed to in the past. So those are the types of targeting. I want to talk a little bit about the complexity of the ad marketplace, and the next panel is really going to take a deeper dive on this. But I think it's important to kind of tee it up for them a little bit. So we were talking about DoubleClick.net earlier, and there's lots of other companies that fall into this category. It's like a basic ad network model. Ad networks are in the business of matching ads to publishers. So they sign up agencies and advertisers on one side, they sign up publishers and maybe publisher networks on the other side, and they find matches between the two. And in most cases, the inventory and the prices are agreed upon ahead of time. So as we said at the beginning, you saw, my browser went to thehill.com, came back, went to doubleclick.net, came back. That was probably based on some sort of deal that was agreed upon in advance, such that DoubleClick would be serving those ads as the ad network for thehill.com. So that's kind of the simple case. If we want to get a little bit more complicated, we can throw an ad server into the mix. And in this example, Mediaplex.com is the ad server. So ad servers can be a number of things, and this is where we start to wade into the space where the edges of what all these entities are get a little bit blurry. Ad servers can be just technology providers. They can literally just serve ads. So they can take directions from other intermediaries or from first parties that say, I want you to serve ad XYZ right now, and they just provide the technology that allows the ad to be served. They can also be more sophisticated, so they can do some of that kind of targeting that I was just talking about. They can be the maintainers of profiles, and they can serve to target the ads in addition to just serving the ads. So if we look at how this might actually work in practice, this is kind of familiar, hopefully, by now. In this example, we're going to use the CNET, my visit to CNET, and this is actually a real example. So our little user who's running on his laptop went to cnet.com. CNET gave back some content and an instruction in JavaScript that said, okay, you need to go to doubleclick.net. All right, my browser knows how to do that by now. We go to doubleclick.net. I send my cookie with my ID. DoubleClick says, oh, okay, you're you, whoever you are, user ID number 228, whatever. Sends back more JavaScript this time. So instead of sending an ad, this time I get more JavaScript that says, okay, browser, you need to go to mediaplex.com, which is the ad server. So my browser says, okay, I can go to mediaplex.com. And as it turns out, I already have a cookie for mediaplex.com. So I go to Mediaplex, I send my cookie along the way, and Mediaplex serves me back the ad. The question of who targeted this ad, whether it was DoubleClick or whether it was Mediaplex, it's hard for me to tell as the consumer, and I was just kind of looking at this on my computer. It could have been DoubleClick. DoubleClick could have used my cookie and said, oh, I know who this is, and I really want to serve her a technology ad. And it could say to Mediaplex, okay, I need a technology ad. Or it could have been all on Mediaplex. So DoubleClick could have said, just give me an ad for this user, you know who it is. And in some cases, that communication that can happen between doubleclick.net and mediaplex.com can happen through what we call URL parameters. And that sounds a little bit scary now that I say it up here. So a URL is just this address that you see, these HTTP : / right? That's what we call a URL. It stands for Uniform Resource Locator. It's just the address of a page that you're trying to go to. And what you see in this example, if you could see it, which you probably really can't, is that there's a sequence of numbers in there, 2397, 9725. Those numbers could be indicating to Mediaplex which ad DoubleClick wants it to serve. So that's a way, by sticking data into the actual URL, into the actual code that's inserted by the JavaScript, to say to Mediaplex, I want you to serve a particular ad. So it's just a mechanism for communication. It's not always used, and it might not have been used here. There's no way for me as the consumer to really know, but they know on the back end whether they're using that to communicate. Now, what if instead of having an ad network and an ad server, we have an ad exchange? This is where it starts to get even more hairy. So ad exchanges work with lots of different parties on the back end. Sometimes they work with networks, they work with ad servers, they work with agencies. And what happens, it looks like a similar process from the consumer's perspective. So I go to cnet.com, I get the page back that's missing a few chunks and some JavaScript. I've taken the JavaScript out of this example. I go to the cnet.com redirects me to the ad exchange and says, you need to go over there to get your ad this time. So we go to the ad exchange. Maybe I have a cookie set from the ad exchange. I send that along. And then some magic happens in the gray cloud between the ad exchange and all these other third parties that it works with. And out of that magic comes an instruction that tells my browser where to get the ad. And then, just like all the other examples, I go there, I send my cookie, if I have one, and I get the ad back. So the big question is, what is that magic that's happening in the gray cloud? It's actually quite magical. So I tried to make it colorful at least so that it would look a little bit less scary. So what do ad exchanges do? Ad exchanges, again, on the one hand, they work with advertisers and with agencies. And advertisers and agencies place ads with the exchange, and then they also place bids on where they want to have those ads served. On the other side, they, again, work with publishers and maybe with publisher networks, and those publishers place bids as well for the kinds of ads that they want to have appear. So it's sort of like the ad network model, except that the exchange takes those bids and in real time matches ads with publishers using an auction, basically. So instead of having everything agreed upon in advance, when my browser makes that call, that mechanism is actually happening in order to make the match between the advertiser and the publisher. And then when that magic has happened, the ad can get served, and it can get served from a number of different places. It can get served from the exchange. It can also, just like in the previous example, can get served from an ad server. So in this example, ad network number 1 is actually working with an ad server. It's working with both the ad server and the exchange. So if it wins the bid in any particular case, it can then serve the ads still through its ad server. And this is where you end up with lots and lots of different kinds of intermediaries all involved in a single ad transaction. Because now, between the advertiser and the publisher, you might have an agency, an ad network, an exchange, and an ad server. And oh, by the way, you might also have a data provider. So what do data providers do? The idea here is that data providers, just like some of those other third parties that we were talking about previously, they go around collecting data about the kinds of things that people do and their behavior online, but they don't actually serve ads. They don't actually serve any content. What they do instead is they share that data with the other third parties who do serve content. And in this case, the ad exchange case, they actually allow bids to be made on audiences instead of on content. So instead of saying, I want ads of a particular type, or I want to serve ads to a publisher of a particular type, you can say, I want to serve ads to a certain kind of internet user. And so that's just another kind of intermediary that sort of gets thrown into the mix. This is all a little bit complicated, and hopefully the next panel will either clarify or mystify you a little bit more, but just wanted to give an overview of exactly how complicated it can get. And finally, since we've been talking kind of a lot about cookies and data exchange, the way that data gets exchanged between all of these intermediaries is not really determinate. So it could be the case that the user IDs are going from one party to the next, and they all get shared along the way. It could be the case that only the ad server at the very end is the one who does any kind of targeting. There's lots and lots of different models and frameworks that all these various parties can sit within, and thus the way that the data is changing hands between the various entities is really dependent upon how the contracts have been signed, how the exchange runs its process behind the scenes. And so those nice simple models where you just had the cookie going to the ad network and the ad getting served back can really start to get much more complex. One bright note to end on after the kind of complicated stuff is this notion of the clear ad notice. So this is a proposal that has been put forth by the Interactive Advertising Bureau and the Network Advertising Initiative, these trade associations for the ad industry. And the idea here is to have kind of a flexible standard that allows data about who's involved in an ad transaction to be surfaced to the consumer and on an ad itself. So what you see here is a little ad slug in the corner of the ad. And if the user were to mouse over or click on the ad slug, what he or she would see, if you could see it, is a listing of who the advertiser is, who the ad network is, or who's delivering, who's actually serving the ad, who targeted the ad, so who was actually using the data to decide which ad was going to be served, and then some other information about finding the privacy policies and how to opt out if you're the consumer. And I bring this up for two reasons. One is that, this is supposed to be a transparency mechanism for consumers, but I think it could also be really, really useful for publishers because it forces information about a single ad transaction that can go through many, many different hands to all be surfaced at the end. And the data that you see represented here is actually just sitting on the page in those little JavaScript tags that we were looking at earlier. So you could actually automate a process to collect this data and learn more about which ads are actually getting served on your page and which third parties are involved in serving them to kind of add a little bit of accountability to the whole process. The other reason why it's interesting for publishers, just as a side note, is that, well, in this example, the ad slug is on the ad itself. It could also be on the publisher real estate. And the specification that they've put out is actually flexible enough that you could have either model. And so if publishers are interested in supporting this kind of thing, they could be involved in actually supporting that little link that users could click on to surface the information about the ad. So that's kind of the end of the complex part, I hope. And hopefully you've gotten a little bit of a sense of how web surfing data can be used to serve internet ads. Now I want to talk about some other kinds of data. And some of these models are really new and emerging, but I think the more that people think about them, the more that they're interested in figuring out how to do them right, and they have some pretty important implications for publishers. There's two aspects to this. One is that as new data comes along, it's going to impact ad effectiveness, and it's therefore going to impact the price of ads, and that's obviously of high concern for publishers. The other one is that if you're using a partner, as a publisher, using a partner that's starting to delve into some of these newer methods, it's important to understand what the privacy provisions are that go along with this new kind of data collection, and to make sure that your partners are keeping in line with whatever kinds of privacy practices you keep as a publisher. So the first one is ISPs as data funnels. What many people have started to realize is that ISPs are sitting on a mountain of personal information. The kind of golden nuggets that ISPs have, in particular for online advertising purposes, are the linkages between personal information, names and addresses on the one hand, and IP addresses on the other. Your ISP is the one who gives you your IP address. It's also the one who gives you your bill, and therefore it knows your name and your address, and it also knows your IP address and can make that kind of correlation. And because of this, there's lots of interest out there in the ad industry in figuring out, well, how can we leverage that? Particularly on the part of these traditional data aggregation companies. So you have lots of companies in the offline marketing world and who have traditionally been more involved in the kind of direct marketing space that collect information from public records, from magazine subscriptions, from purchases, and they have all this data about what you do in the offline world. It's been used for a long time. And the question is, how can we kind of move that data into the web space and kind of merge it with online data? And one of the key linkages is being able to tie your IP address to your name and your address, because the offline data is all keyed to who you are in the brick and mortar world, and your online data, in some cases, is keyed to your IP address. So this is a little bit of a complicated example. I'm not going to really run through the whole thing, but the idea here is that Harry Potter, up there in the corner, went to visit a website, and on that website there was an ad network, just like the ad networks we were looking at earlier. And what happens here is that the ISP is leveraged to make the mapping between the IP address and Harry Potter. So in this case, Harry Potter's IP address is 5.6.7.8. He goes to the website. That IP address has been assigned by a particular ISP. And what the ISP can do is look up his name. Oh, I know who he is. He's Harry Potter. And that data can get sent to one of these traditional data aggregation companies who doesn't know Harry's IP address, but does know that Harry does know some demographics about Harry. So let's say he's 18 to 25 and he makes, $50,000 because he's young. That data can then get funneled back through the ISP. So now the ISP has the demographic information about Harry. And that demographic information, along with the IP address, can get funneled back to the ad network and then used to serve the ad to Harry. So when it gets back to the ad network says, oh, okay, I'm going to serve this guy the Jelly Belly ad because he's young and he doesn't make a lot of money, as opposed to, the Lexus ad or something else. And so this is kind of a new twist on the old kinds of targeting that have happened in the offline world, but haven't really happened too much in the online world. And just to give you a sense of the privacy side of these things, we've seen this model being experimented with credit scores, because there's lots of companies out there who know your credit score, and it's tied only to your name. And so to be able to use an ISP to kind of leverage that connection to find out, oh, this person has a credit score of X, Y, or Z, and to be able to leverage that into the targeting of an ad is kind of this new and emerging model, and something which raises some privacy concerns, as you can imagine. So that's using ISPs as data funnels. The next one is deep packet inspection. So with deep packet inspection, there's a number of companies that have experimented in this space. Form is the big one in the UK. Nebuad was the big one in the US. There have been a few others. I think Adzilla went out of business. I think Front Porch is still in business. The idea here is that these kinds of third-party vendors install equipment on ISPs' networks in order to be able to cull information about what people are doing. So in those models we looked at earlier, you had third parties working with publishers, setting cookies on websites to collect information about where are people going on the web. This model sidesteps that completely. It actually cuts publishers out altogether, because instead of working with agencies and advertisers on one side and publishers on the other, these kinds of vendors work with agencies and advertisers on one side and ISPs on the other. So instead of collecting information about web surfing using cookies and all these web technologies, they install equipment directly in an ISP network in order to collect that same information, and actually more information, because they can see every website you go to. They don't have to have a presence. They don't have to set a cookie in order to be able to collect that kind of information. So again, you can see maybe a little bit more of a privacy risk here. I certainly think there is one. But also just a different model altogether that doesn't really involve publishers necessarily at all. There was a lot of attention to this in the Congress a couple of years ago, and thus the model has kind of gone out of fashion a little bit. But I don't think that means it's gone forever, and certainly could resurrect itself in the future. So that's deep packet inspection. I want to talk a little bit about mobile data. There are almost as many mobile phones as people in the United States, and about close to 20% of those are smartphones, and more every day. So there's certainly a lot to be said for serving content on mobile devices, and certainly advertising on mobile devices. There's a few different vectors that can be used to serve both content and advertising. One of them is the app, right? So lots of us are now familiar with apps and app stores on mobile devices, and that's the Wall Street Journal app on the iPhone that you can see there. The other one is just basic web browsing, and so the other image there is just me surfing to the Wall Street Journal on my Android phone. Both of these kind of vectors for serving content actually reuse all the same technologies that we saw on the regular web. They use HTTP, they use JavaScript, they use cookies. And so in some cases, the story is kind of similar from a technological perspective. But there are a couple of differences. One is the kind of absence of Flash. So you may have heard recent spats in the industry about Flash. Flash is a technology now owned by Adobe that animates your ads on the web. And a lot of mobile devices don't support Flash necessarily. So sometimes when you surf to a page, I was actually really surprised when I went to this Wall Street Journal page that the ad that you can sort of see there in the corner for the Sheraton actually appeared, because a lot of times when you go to websites on your mobile device, you just see nothing where you would normally see an ad, and that's because of the lack of support for Flash. The other difference is that the user controls on mobile devices can be much less robust than they can be on regular computers. And I didn't really talk about user controls too much. Hopefully they'll come up on the privacy panel. But in terms of being able to do things like delete cookies or control the different kinds of content that you want on your device, it can be a lot trickier on a mobile device because it's smaller, has a smaller screen space. The settings aren't as uniform. People aren't as familiar with them. So that's another kind of small difference between the mobile world and the desktop world. One of the bigger differences, I would say, is location. So we talked earlier about using IP addresses to get kind of metro area level location. On your mobile device, there's a few ways that you can get a much more granular location. And this is actually, and I would include in this category laptops. This is actually me on my laptop using Firefox, which is actually location enabled, to find myself on a map. I almost found myself. I do not live in a river, but Google thinks I live in a river. I almost live in a river. So mobile devices have several different technologies that can be used to much more precisely locate the user than an IP address. So that's GPS. In this case, it's Wi-Fi. So my laptop talking to Wi-Fi base stations and using them to kind of triangulate where I am. The cell towers can be used to triangulate as well, and this gives you a much more precise location on the order of meters instead of on the order of miles. And thus, there's a large potential for fine-grained targeting. You know, instead of showing me the Dell ad for all of the UK, I can get the Dell ad for the computer store down the street from me in Oxford. It also means, again, a new vector for privacy invasion and a new need for user control there. I would also say, the last thing about mobile devices is that they're much more personal than a desktop computer that might even be shared between multiple members of a family. So whereas the cookie is that piece that is really needed in order to be able to re-identify and make sure that you can find the user again who's been surfing to a bunch of different sites. On a mobile device, you have a bunch of different unique IDs that can variously be sent back and forth between the user and the publisher, or between the user and the advertiser. And those can be much more permanent. They can actually be device IDs that don't change and that the user can't really change. So that's kind of another aspect which is different in the mobile world than the desktop world. And finally, we come to social data. So we probably could have the entire panel, the entire conversation today, just about social media and social data, because there's so much going on. But I just want to talk about one aspect, which is sort of this increased layering of social data onto the rest of the web. And there's a few different initiatives that have popped up recently that are allowing this tighter integration between data on social networks and the web at large, but I'm just going to talk about Facebook to give an example. So Facebook recently introduced a feature which is called instant personalization, and the instant personalization program currently has 3 partners signed up. One of them is Yelp.com. So I visited Yelp, and as you can see here, this is, again, just the log of what happened when I went to Yelp.com. A couple of calls there to the first-party server to Yelp.com, and then a call to DoubleClick as a third-party ad network, and then there's a call to Facebook. So now, if I'm a Facebook user and I'm logged in, when I go to Yelp.com, you actually get a third-party call being made to Facebook. And what happens? What happens with that call? Well, there's a few kinds of data that Facebook is now sharing directly with Yelp: my name, my gender, my current city, the networks that I'm in, my profile page, my whole friend list, and all the pages that I'm a fan of. So if I'm logged into Facebook and I go to Yelp.com, all of that data gets sent to Yelp automatically, unless I've opted out. So there's an opt-out offered on Facebook. On the same day that Facebook announced instant personalization, they also announced another initiative, and hopefully many people have seen these kind of widgets pop up on various pages across the web, because I've seen them everywhere. What's happening here is that when you go to the publisher page, you can see the activity of your Facebook friends being presented to you on the publisher page. So here I can see that a couple of my friends, they shared particular Washington Post articles on Facebook, and that's what that widget is showing me. In this case, there's no data being shared between Facebook and the first-party publisher. So in the other case, there was data being shared, and that system has only been rolled out with 3 sites. This little widget has been rolled out on lots and lots and lots of sites, but there's not data being shared between the first party and Facebook. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that the potential that this data sharing creates for advertising purposes is huge, right? Things like even just gender and current city to actually know definitively those data items as you're trying to target an ad on a page could be really huge in terms of ad targeting. And so even though there's lots of pages that aren't doing the data sharing yet and only a few that are, I think as you look to the future, you can imagine a situation where that data sharing does start to happen, and what it means for advertising, and also, I think, what it means for privacy. So I'm going to stop there and ask my lovely panelists to come join me so we can have a chat about all these things.
She's the best. So now we're going to try to unpack what all this means from a business perspective. I'm not going to read you the bio. Let me actually stand up for a second. I'm not going to read you all the bios of our panelists. They're all in the materials. But I want to give you enough background on each of our panelists that you have a sense of where each of them is coming from. I'll start with Lincoln Milstein sitting down. Lincoln is a media company guy. After a distinguished newsroom career, he became one of the founders, really one of the pioneers in digital journalism, one of the founders of Boston.com, became the COO of New York Times Digital in 2000, and he's currently SVP at Hearst Newspapers, where he's one of the principal architects of the Yahoo Consortium, the consortium that includes 35 media companies and over 900 newspapers in a partnership which he'll tell you something about with Yahoo. Lincoln also has, as does Alyssa, a Stanford connection. He was a fellow, a National Endowment for the Humanities professional journalism fellow here in 1980 and 1981. Next to Lincoln is Matt Carr. He's a Microsoft guy, not in the Microsoft guy versus Mac guy, but a guy who runs the Microsoft Media Network. What that means is that he's responsible for all of Microsoft's ad targeting and data investments, the network and platform technologies, the Atlas advertiser suite, and all of Microsoft performance media programs and its audience targeting for advertisers. Next to him is my old friend Dave Hills. Dave is sort of he's sort of an omnibus panelist here. He's played many roles in the advertising ecosystem. He's a media company guy. I first met him 15 years ago when he was running ad sales for the Cox Interactive Media. He's a search guy. He was president of the vertical search company LookSmart, and he's also a VC guy. He's now a partner with KPG Ventures. And next to him is Pam Haran. Pam is really the leading spokesperson for the business interests of companies that create and publish content on the internet. She's president of the Online Publishers Association, the trade association that represents quality content publishers. She's really the voice of content publishers before Congress, before the FTC, and before the advertising community. And you know Alyssa. So what we're going to do now is try to unpack some of what Alyssa's told us about what's going on there from a technology perspective and trying to get a sense of what's going on from a business perspective and why. As many of you who've been to lots of conferences know, often the very best conversations don't take place when the panel's in front of the room, but they take place in the bar late at night afterward. And what we're going to try to do is to recreate in advance that barroom conversation. So I want you to all imagine that bottle of water is the latest Nouveau Retro cocktail. I don't know if you've been out here for a couple of days, but Nouveau Retro cocktails are very big in San Francisco now. So imagine your bottles of water are your favorite cocktail. It's actually your second one. And we're just going to try to have a conversation among the panelists about what's going on. And after a little while, I'm going to invite the rest of you to belly up to the bar and join in that conversation. But I want to start with a question for my friend Dave. Dave, when I met you 15 years ago, this was a really simple business, right? You were selling advertising. You were a media company guy. You sold advertising. There were advertisers. They had some agencies, and they bought advertising. What happened and why?
We both lost a lot of hair over the last 15 years, John. You know, a number of things happened, and the first thing you have to think about is what happened to the audience, right? Life was blissfully simple when I was in the television business in 1980. There were 3 networks, There wasn't much cable, a little bit of pay. I don't think there maybe CNN or something like that. And the audiences were very, very concentrated. They were concentrated in magazines. They were concentrated in radio. They were easy for the advertisers to buy, easy for the advertisers to access. The agency business supported that. Agencies could make a profit dealing with advertisers, with media companies. A bunch of media company guys would show up at the advertiser's doorstep through the agency, knock on the door, take some money and go home. The advertising was sold two ways. It was either sold on an audience or a content basis. Television was always an audience play. Magazines were generally a content play. There was some affinity to the content. Through cable and then on through the internet, what happened was that people are much more facile with technology than we thought they were. They started to use this stuff. And instead of going to 3 television stations and watching the 6 o'clock news every night, they want news when they want it. They can look at video now. And the audience just splintered all over Hell's Half Acre. And what happened was it became practically impossible, or impossible from a practical standpoint, to actually corral and buy that audience in the numbers that they were used to. So it's not that publishers' numbers have fallen, but the amount, but how disparate the audience is has grown tremendously. And as a result, the great chart that Alyssa put up that shows the ecosystem, if you will, I'm from New York, so I call it the plumbing under the streets, right? It was built in layers, and it's built in layers over the past 15 years. And the central argument right now, I think anyway, is a very, very fundamental one, and it's actually interesting. I have a publisher person on my right, I have an intermediary person on my left, and that's what the debate is. Is, at the end of the day, media going to be bought on an audience basis or on a content adjacency basis? And if you think about what's going on in the online advertising industry right now, that's what's at the central core of everything. Underneath that, I'll make one more comment. Underneath that is a very, very visceral discussion, I guess, around who owns the data, right? Lincoln says, it's my data. That's my person that you're targeting. Well, a third-party intermediary, an ad network, which I run ad networks, might say, no, that's my information. And then lastly, the person placing the money on them, WPP, the large multinational advertising agency, came up very publicly about a year ago and said, no, that's my data. So you've got an argument going on about who owns the data against an audience that's gone a lot wider than anybody thought that it would, against the fundamental argument of whether this is an audience or a context-based medium.
Alyssa, don't you think the consumer owns the data?
Yeah, I was going to say there's one other possibility there, which would be I believe I own my own data. Actually, I don't really like the ownership paradigm, but yes, it's very important. I think the consumer should be the force.
But the consumer needs, there's a certain level of that plumbing that the consumer needs just to do stuff, right? I mean, if you had to log into the Wall Street Journal every morning because there were no cookies.
No, I'm not objecting to the fact that the data exists. I'm just saying that the privacy perspective, I think, would dictate that the user should at least be in control of the data, and let's not really talk about ownership.
As the intermediary, I'll chime in here. I mean, I firmly believe that the idea of controlling and owning data is a okay topic, but I think the way in which all the parties manage and transfer rights to that data is probably the most important conversation, because when you look at an ad call, I mean, Alyssa's visual on those ad calls, it's not just the consumer and the publisher. It's not the consumer and the advertiser. It's not the consumer and the ad server or the exchange. It's the consumer and all of those. Everyone is at that party. When the ad is rendered, everyone is participating in it. And so I believe everyone has a legitimate right to benefit from the data. And I think the most important thing is how we distribute the rights and the way in which that data is managed so that the consumer is protected appropriately. And so, that's no easy feat, but I think that's sort of, as we think about pushing this industry forward, I think getting in a debate about ownership, like, what WPP has gone out and said, that just leads to more arguments. So.
Well, and at the heart of it, which Dave was touching upon, is a lot of it comes back to the business model. So, the question that John was asking about why has this all transpired, the reality was, as he mentioned, there used to be very specific silos that existed in terms of the different roles that the publisher played in terms of aggregating an audience and attracting consumers with content. The advertiser was building ads and was making 15% on top of the expenses that they were, for serving those ads. And those days are over. I mean, there are no clear lines, and it's a combination of what Dave talked about in terms of the bifurcation of the audiences, and then also the fact that if you look on the web, there are thousands of places that consumers can go. So from your 3 networks to the thousands or hundreds of thousands of websites. So, the part of the reason why we're having this conversation is it does come back to the business model. And, to Dave's point about is it audience or content, I don't think it's a or. I think the reality is there's got to be a balance here because there's science and there's also a lot of art that comes into play here. But the business model for publishers today, our members invested over $500 million in the creation of original content last year. And majority of that, 95% of that, is free, meaning it's advertising supported. So the data conversation is one that's obviously very compelling in terms of how do we make sure the consumer experience is right, as well as being able to figure out how do we effectively monetize.
Then the other question is really, which is one we were talking on a phone call a couple of phone calls ago, is who's a buyer and who's a seller anymore? So you've got all this plumbing, and it's all confused. It used to be really simple, right? When I was calling on Madison Avenue selling television spots in 1980, I was a seller. I went and saw a buyer. They gave me some money. I ran the television spots. I made some commission. Today, I don't think anybody can really discern who a buyer or a seller is. A publisher will have a proprietary sales force, right? Matt's technology products will have proprietary sales forces against them. But as you filter down more into the ecosystem, it's really confusing who a buyer and a seller is. And that creates an awful lot of friction, I would say, from a business perspective, because everybody's always trying to yank accounts from one another. My data is better, I can get you a higher ROI, my content's better, I can get you a lower cost. And it really becomes very, very confusing, which I think exacerbates everything that Pam and Matt were saying.
Yeah. I mean, just to build off of that, I think there's so many new parties in the system, in the plumbing now, focused on value capture. How can I get a piece of what was let's just say 40% margin, or lower or higher? You now have 3 players trying to take a piece of that 40% margin. When, as an industry, I think we should be focusing more on value creation and how do we take and create more relevancy for users and create more ROI for advertisers and for publishers. And Pam, just to respond to your point, I think in the last 7 years, a lot of publishers did not know what they were giving up. I think a lot of publishers, and I worked for many years for MSN, so I was a publisher for a long time, and we went to ad networks because we could not sell all of our inventory. We just were not capable of doing that. And so it's not like ad networks appeared out of nowhere and we're handing out drugs to kids. I mean, there was a distinct need, and publishers drove that need for better or for worse, and I was one of those publishers. And that's why DrivePM and Ad.com and all those players jumped up. And it was publishers who said, you need to protect our brand, and so there's no channel conflict, so please be a blind network. Don't tell your advertisers exactly who your publishers are that you work with. And a lot of this stuff has crept up over the years that I think we'd all regret in the way in which that materialized. And now, I think it's in full transparency. Those data providers are now clearly, setting in motion the types of data they can capture, and everyone's standing up and saying, there's too many fingers in this pie. We got to sort of tighten it down.
And it's probably an important thing to hone in if you're a publisher. I ran About.com as COO 2 or 3 companies ago. And there were really high value areas of About.com where we could afford to send a proprietary sales force out there. So we had 57, I think at that point, disease-related sites. And we could get in to see, the guy that ran sales for me could get in to see any brand manager at any pharmaceutical company that he needed to, because we were number 2 in the rating service to WebMD. We were relevant to their plans. There were other parts of the network, decent ones, like computing and technology, where we were number 9 or 10 or something like that, and we couldn't get arrested. We weren't relevant to Intel's life. We weren't large enough to be there. And ad networks actually served a really, really good purpose, because from a publisher's perspective, you sell a buck, it's going to cost you something to have sold that, and if it costs you more to sell it than you didn't bring it in, that's a pretty negative margin that you can't extend for for very, very long. So I think the ecosystem's always going to have a balance of intermediaries and proprietary sales forces. It has to.
So I'm hearing why networks are useful to publishers. Tell us a little bit about the tension between networks and publishers. Why there's sort of a love-hate relationship between the networks and the publishers. Why do publishers put up with the networks still?
Do you want me to take this,
Sure,
Lincoln?
anybody.
Do you want me to start, Lincoln, or do you want to start?
Well, I think one of the, by the way, every time I sit on one of these panels, I get more confused. So. Thanks. I think one of the problems that we have is the definition of publisher. You know, when the internet came along, I thought, well, this is easy. We'll just start the digital version of what we do offline, and that'll be that. But to David's point, you know, consumer package companies are, in fact, publishers. I go to my American Airlines site. I tell American Airlines where I'm going, so they're getting geolocation information from me. When I print my boarding pass, right, you see an ad on my boarding pass targeted to me. So you have the opportunity for a lot of companies that heretofore were not defined as publishers who are in fact in the long tail. So that's one problem, just the definition of publishers. But I think the question that you're asking has to do more with traditional publishers, brand publishers like Hearst. And I think David, I think it was actually Matthew who made the point that we were our own worst enemy. We didn't know what we were giving up. So in 1998, 99, we had a lot of traffic to Boston.com. In 2002, in the middle of that recession, we had a lot of traffic to nytimes.com, and we couldn't sell it all, right? Not only could we not sell it all, but it was increasing 20, 30% a year. And we had trouble forecasting that growth. We would always have inventory that we couldn't sell. Mm-hmm. And along come these networks and say, well, we'll take it off your hands. And I mean, what would you rather have? Would you have no money for that inventory or 79 cents a CPM? Well, I'll take the 79 cents. It's not much money, but I'm getting a couple $1 million from taking that inventory from these networks. And that's how it started. The problem that we have now is there's so much inventory because everybody's a publisher that is really driving the CPM to the floor for our traditional publishers. So you're seeing traditional publishers now react to that, and we're saying, we don't want your remnant money. We're going to we're going to protect the high value inventory that we have. And the New York Times has pulled the plug on remnant buys. I believe that CNN has done that as well. We're in conversations with a lot of newspaper companies that will begin to pull the plug on networks buying our inventory. And because we want to differentiate our professional content produced by professional journalists from the fray. So there's the tension. Whereas we were taking that blood money like everybody else, and it made our P&L look reasonable for a number of years. We realized that all it did was drive us all to the lowest common denominator.
And I think that, to Lincoln's point, that's part of where the system's broken down, because there's been significant pressure on the value, on the CPM of that inventory. So as Matt said, when we started on this journey, the idea was, let's have a blind network. You can sell the value of the audience, but let's not be publicizing the fact that you're hosting New York Times inventory. And they sat across the table, and there was an agreement. Well, when they went out into the field, for many of those ad networks, they did not live up to that agreement. Now, it's not to say that all ad networks are bad. As Lincoln mentioned, many of our members have made a business decision in the last several years, ESPN, New York Times, Weather, Edmunds.com, to not work with ad networks because they felt that they could better represent their brand, as Lincoln indicated. But we've also had so many stories where I had a board member go in to visit an advertising agency and is talking about their site and what they want to do with this advertising. There, an advertiser said, we're absolutely going to be running on your site, but we're going to buy it through XYZ ad network. And the board member says, we don't sell our inventory through ad networks and never have. And the agency executive pulls out a sheet and says, your logo's on here. It says this is the ad network. You're represented. Your inventory is, we can get your inventory through them. So unfortunately, some of the breakdown is through bad business practices. And as I said, not all ad networks are created equal, but that is what has driven many of these companies that have worked with ad networks to say no more. I want to represent my inventory. You know, it's not worth it because there's an opportunity cost. So when ESPN did their analysis 3 years ago, they looked at the opportunity cost. They said to even sell this much is going to have a downward pricing pressure on my standard inventory. I want nothing to do with it.
So we're giving networks a block list. You know, we don't want Macy's, which is a great traditional newspaper advertiser. We want them to buy our sites directly, and we think there's great value in our professional content sites. We don't want them to pull an end run and go to a network and buy our inventory for 79 cents. So we'll give the networks a block list saying these companies, we will not buy it through. You cannot place it on our sites.
It might be worth a moment just to spend a little bit of time on the buyers themselves, the agencies, and just talk about their business a bit, because that's changed a lot. And that's been part of the impetus for all this, too. The ad agency business was never a great margin business, but it used to be okay, right? I mean, the agencies would get paid 15% on media buys. They were making television commercials, and they could charge $400,000 or $500,000 a television commercial. And I had friends that were in the agency business. Pam's husband was in the agency business, and for a long time, it was pretty good. And you know, along comes cable, and then the internet, and a couple of ad recessions, one in '84, and then another one in '91, and then the one in 2000, 2001, and I'm realizing how old I am right now. And their businesses changed. What happened was the concept of an agency of record where Procter & Gamble would commit to a couple of agencies, that went away. Procter & Gamble would take their business to whoever gave them the best rate on media. The media commissions themselves went from 15% to 1.5% or 1%. I don't know what the scale is now, but it's just really incredible. And if you think about where an agency always made its money, it was they made it on the creative. And nobody's found a way to make a lot of money on online creative. It's not the same as making a fancy Coca-Cola ad with, you know, stars and all that other stuff in it, where you can ship, you know, 500 people off and charge Coca-Cola a lot of money. So the agencies now are also faced with the same thing that the publishers are, which is a splintering audience. And now you think of the media buyers in these media agencies that aren't making as much money as they used to as a company. Now all of a sudden they got 400 or 500 publishers that want to show up on their doorstep and sell them a banner or a video ad or something like that. It becomes very, very challenging for those agencies to do it. So the agencies, as Lincoln said, the publishers needed it. The agencies also need it. They need this audience queued up in a logical, sensible way for them so they can access it economically from their own business's perspective.
Yeah, and that's the impetus behind a lot of the technology that arrived on our shores, you know, about 10 years ago, third-party ad servers. You know, agencies and advertisers came and said, I'm working with 20 publishers. I don't want to deduplicate my reach and frequency across those 20 publishers. I don't want to hit the same users across those 20 publishers. Help me with that math and help me with that tracking. And so, you know, Alyssa talked about the purpose of third-party ad servers as being for ad serving. Really, the most important purpose for buyers for ad servers is the reporting and analytics and the deduplication and managing those types of metrics. And so you have this many-to-many relationship that just blossomed with the internet, you know, between agencies and publishers. And it's these intermediaries, whether it's an ad server, an ad network, or now an exchange, that's sort of helping to turn that to a many-to-one, which is what everyone ultimately wants. And just, you know, to return back on this content versus audience debate. I firmly believe, I agree with the panelists, that it's going to be an and discussion. American Express, one of the top DR advertisers in the world, has, hundreds of millions of dollars they spend on brand advertising as well. They're one of the largest DR spenders as well. And their various buying arms go down those two paths. On one side, they come to us and say, I need huge reach to audience, and I want to buy at-scale audiences, and I'm buying through networks and exchanges to do that. At the same time, I'm launching this new rebrand of the Amex brand, and I want to be tight with all of your affluent content and tight with these types of contextual experiences. And I think that's a healthy path for advertisers to go down. And so I think, we're going to see this sort of coexistence between high-end content and publishers who absolutely should reserve the right not to work with intermediaries and networks, but also scaled plays, as we call them, scaled buying plays that allow advertisers to get higher reach, higher ROI with a fraction of the cost of working with hundreds of publishers. So I think we'll see both of those worlds evolve, hopefully in a healthy way together.
I think the Great Recession has exacerbated this as well. I mean, if you're an agency and you've just gone in and shot half of your media buying sales force because you are trying to trim costs, you've got a 27-year-old media buyer there with a customer who wants to buy reach. And so what does he or she do? They buy networks, or they go to buy Yahoo and MSN, and with one phone call, one click, they've accomplished that goal for their customer.
Then they can get to happy hour.
And they go to happy hour. And
John buys.
Which is important.
and so, but I think that's going to change. I mean, the Great Recession required everybody to look for the greatest efficiency. I want to remind everybody that it's still early. For the most part, the internet has been a response-driven medium. I don't think brand building is quite there yet. You can't convince me that any brand is really understanding and knowing how to use the internet for building their brand. Certainly the consumer package companies are still very wary of it. I do think that this thing is going to be a game changer, and I do think that this thing is going to present advertising in some of the ways that we used to think of. I remember when I was a boy, about 12 years old, visiting my uncle in Chicago, and he worked for Leo Burnett. And I said, Uncle Ted, what do you do for a living? He says, well, I make people buy things they didn't even know they wanted to buy. So I understood that as the fundamentals of advertising. And if you take targeting and data management to the extreme, you will have every single human being on the planet targeted and understood. So if brands, if all they did was to go to only people who are predisposed to buying their products, then we'd have no growth. And I think fundamentally this thing will, and other forms of new digital media will bring back the notion of creating dreams, doing what a 30-second TV spot used to do, create excitement, create great stories, and the internet hasn't done that.
So I think I saw not too long ago a statistic that something like 40% of consumer time, media consumption time, is spent on the web, but only about 20% of the advertising dollars are spent on the web. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things that both Dave and Lincoln just mentioned, and that is really creative. So we heard it from the agency perspective, where they can't make as much money in terms of building that creative. So we haven't seen the ad directors getting real psyched about building creative online. They're much more interested in getting their Clio, for their TV campaigns. So that's one piece of it. And then it leads very well into the other piece that Lincoln was talking about, which is the fact that this medium has really been for direct. We set ourselves up years ago when we said it's the most measurable medium, it's going to be great. And that's really direct related, because if you look at the role of direct, it's about delivering an immediate action at that time, versus branding, which is about building a relationship with the consumer over time. And that creative is very, very different. So I think that as Lincoln said, the opportunity for us is really, and I agree, I think that the work that Apple's doing and some of the other manufacturers that we're going to see coming down the pike will hopefully really provide a new platform for that to be displayed and demonstrated, for us to be able to engage the consumer in a different way, because up to date, there really has been no memorable creative on this platform. I think creative is a big piece. The other piece is measurement. Our ability to really measure the impact, to understand what is engagement online. If you look at a Procter & Gamble product manager, he's looking at how he's got some very defined metrics that he's measuring that we don't have online. So again, until we can clean that up as well, I almost feel like we're in a self-help group here, giving you all of our problems, because it's actually a really fun industry to be in. But so I think it's a combination of the creative and the metrics.
And I think to John's question, if you look at the introduction of new media, take cable for instance, they started to measure the spending on ad spending on cable, I think in 1980. It took cable 18 years to reach parity with its audience share, and so what happened was the audience share went like that, the revenue share went like that, and then all of a sudden it started to shoot up. And you can see that I think the bulk of that occurred in the early 90s. And it happened in two waves. I'm sorry. One was in '84 when they introduced cable ratings into the Nielsen rating book. That unleashed a lot of money because the buyers could say, okay, I get that currency. It's a national rating point. I know how to buy that. Yeah. And then the second thing was more improvement in the measurement system and a critical mass of audience in commercial cable, along with a price that approached network television. Then all of a sudden the buyer said, okay, I'm going to put more money on cable because that's where the audience going. It's at the same prices. It's at the same price as broadcast now. You can see the same thing in online video right now. Online video isn't the Wild West that banners on pages are. Online video started to run, I guess, at some volume, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a $40 1,000 buy. And the advertisers were buying it because they knew that's where they needed to be. All of a sudden, the price started to come down because the supply of more people started to watch video online, plus the recession. And now it's at, we've invested in a video ad network. We've invested in a video intermediary, by the way. And now the prices come down to like $20, $25, so it's about the same price as network television, and money is flooding into video now. So it'll take, what they say is that if it took cable 18 years, it'll probably take the internet maybe 12 to 15 years to get to audience and dollar share parity. It's happening faster.
Well, you bring up cable. It's just amazing to me, the evolution of cable. I mean, cable, when it first started, was the backwater for all the direct response ads, right? Yeah. All the ambulance chasing ads. Oops, sorry about that.
Personal injury lawyers.
And I never got that. I never understood why one television show was so different from another, which is one click away. Why one was considered the low end environment and NBC was considered much higher end. But you're right, it took a long time for advertisers to believe that cable could be a brand building environment. I think we have the exact same thing going on still on the internet. I mean, how many of those tooth whitening ads are you going to tolerate? And I mean, you guys should know, what are the 2 top keywords on the internet that command the highest price? You should know that, right?
Mesothelioma.
It's one. And DWI is the other, right? So, I mean, this is right up your alley here. So, that's going to evolve. And so, you've heard the famous story where, who am I thinking of? The brain dead, from Massachusetts, the former governor, Romney. You've heard the famous story of Romney when he was running. And his ads, because they bought it through a network, Mitt Romney's ads ended up on the gay men's sites, right? But
He didn't get too many votes.
well, but I do think we're going to approach a point where environments do matter, and the consumer package companies are not going to want their ads rotated in a slot next to those dancing bear ads and teeth whitening ads and those DR ads. So it's going to take a while, but I think as we come out of this recession, you're going to see some significant changes.
And I think the data point that helps reinforce Pam's earlier comment is 30% of direct response advertising is now spent online, and only probably less than 5% of brand advertising is spent online. You know, folks like P&G, you know, spend less than 1.5% of their budget online. And so whether it's video, whether it's, you know, the creative palette, whether it's measurement, I also think that the fourth pillar is, as publishers, and I know the OPA is leading the charge on this, you know, we've got to create the experience. You know, the iPad's done a great job, but on the web, we can do even richer experiences and creating better ad units and those types of things that'll get all the creatives excited about digital. When you're cramming everything into a 720 pixels by 90 pixels, you can't win any Clios or do anything like that, and thus it goes straight to the DR guys. And then lastly is we got to decrease our supply. I mean, I think we've just, whether it's become addicted to, you know.
Well, we have to differentiate our supply. I mean, it's not all content is, not all inventory is.
And meter. I mean, we've worked with so many publishers that say, wow, if I just stuck another ad here and ran it through your network, you know, I could, even though it's 30 cents, that's, you know, $2 million in the year. That'll help me hit my quota, you know. And so we've got to sort of take a much more measured response to how we manage supply in this type of business.
Now, I promised everybody that we'd open up the bar, and I do want to take questions. Catherine, did you have a microphone that you wanted to walk around with people? I don't want to interrupt this conversation. We're going to keep going, but I want to let you know that we'd be happy to start taking questions from the audience. Let me ask you, Lincoln. You probed the idea of, or raised the idea of differentiating. You're making decisions about there's some content you'll sell through the network, and there's some advertising you'll sell through a network, and some advertising you're only going to sell directly. Can you talk about how you make that decision?
Well, I mean, we have customers who have been loyal customers for decades, and we're trying to sell them a value proposition. We think, you know, we think we have premium inventory, and we don't want to have an inadvertent situation where they could pull an end run. We go and make the sale, and they say thank you very much, and understand the value proposition, and then go to the network and buy us for 75 cents.
Is that a distinction you're making between some of your inventory that's premium and other inventory that isn't premium, or is all of the inventory, are you describing it all as premium?
No, the inventory is tiered. So there is what we call run-of-site inventory, all right, which is the lowest form of inventory, has no targeting capability, has no, it's run-of-site news inventory, general news inventory. But we have inventory that's in great demand. Our technology inventory is in great demand. Our business inventory is in great demand. Our travel inventory is in great demand. So that's a different tier. And then we have special customized inventory. If you want to run an interstitial off our homepage with some rich media, we'll get much higher CPMs for that. So there are different tiers.
And Pam, is that a common practice among your members?
Oh, sure. And I think that you know, as we talked about before in terms of the, you know, the roles of the different intermediaries, the opportunity to be able to, you know, work directly with a publisher to be able to understand, you know, what's the client's marketing objectives and be able to design a program that is going to be able to, you know, combination of what we heard from Alyssa in terms of, it could be a combination of contextually as well as geo, as well as behavioral and targeted served. I mean, the opportunity is there. It's not to say that there isn't value in that run-of-site inventory that may even be served through an ad network, but to Lincoln's point, you know, you are, you know, it's just like our parents taught us when we were young, you know, it's all about the company you keep. And the reality is, if you're using an ad network, you don't always know where your ad's going to appear. And so I think the reality is not all, you know, content is going to be created equal, therefore.
And do you know what percentage of your members' inventory is sold through networks and what percentage is sold directly?
So the revenue, we do a benchmarking study, and the revenue that is associated with inventory that's sold through ad networks is less than 5%. So it's not a big number.
But you have a particular type of media company publisher, right? Yours would be the Hearsts and the Coxes and
So the
right?
criteria for membership at the OPA is your core business is the creation of original content. So we've got everyone from those companies you've mentioned, Hearst, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. We have pure plays like Edmunds, Huffington Post, Reuters. So really, it's anyone that creates original content. And you're right, but what I roll up into that benchmark is obviously our members, and it happens to be most of those platinum brands that you mentioned.
Right, so then there are other types of publishers, though, legitimate ones,
Well,
but
it's
they're
the
just...
airlines.
Right.
I mean, as Lincoln mentioned.
Or
right?
even the companies that use WordPress or a blog thing
Sure.
to create a blog network of 50 or 60 blogs. They're real publishers. They're not relevant to Pam's world, but their audience isn't big enough that they can actually get in front of an advertiser or an agency to sell it.
Sure.
Right, the advertiser or agent's gonna say, I'd love to talk to you, but you know what, by the time I get done buying Pam's clients and buying some stuff through Microsoft and a handful of other places, I'm tapped. And so you'll have, so the point is, while Pam's clients might only have 5% of their stuff done through networks, other legitimate, not old line, but legitimate publishers might have 65 or 70% because they're not big enough that they can actually get the money on their own.
I see we got a question over here, James.
So, thanks, John. My wife has a small business. She's got a little tennis product. She orders her own, she buys her own online advertising through ad exchanges. It seems to me that the process of buying and selling advertising is sort of what touches on what you were just saying, Dave, has been democratized or leveled in a way that publishing has been democratized or leveled. It seems to me that's not going away anytime soon. How's that going to impact the online advertising market and how's it going to impact traditional publishers as well?
I think, one man's opinion, if there were a flood of small and medium-sized businesses that accessed automated buying, and those automated buying sites, the ad exchanges, actually could target well. So, I guess the old analogy would be that in Tennis Magazine you had front of the book advertisers and back of the book advertisers. Your wife's small tennis product would appear in the back of the book, not because it's not a good product, but that's where everybody went to find all the add-on products to play tennis, right? It's an old magazine set of terms. I think if that stuff really occurred, and you could have small and medium-sized businesses have it make sense for them to go buy, that would start to raise CPMs as well, because then your wife could go find the Hearst publication that matched her product, know that she got the right thing. Lincoln isn't going to lose money on it because he doesn't have to have a salesperson call on her, and it's a decent quality ad put into the sports section of a particular newspaper. So I think that's actually a very, very good thing as time goes on.
The other important dynamic that I don't think we've touched on is the shift in pricing. The negotiated rates of the days gone past have now been replaced in these automated exchanges through auctions. AdSense is one, all the exchanges are doing auctions. And so your wife and the thousands and hundreds of thousands of other small providers and advertisers are doing a very important thing, and that's providing bid pressure. They are bidding on keywords or they're bidding on target audiences. And so the more players in the system that do that are going to drive up rates and hopefully, and more money into the system. So, as we think about the democratization of media, both on the publishing and the advertising side, the flow of players is going to do wonders, I think, for sort of, making this a much more healthy ecosystem. In the days gone past of sort of negotiating up fronts, that'll still be important, but I think you'll find a lot more sort of healthy economics in the business.
So the question that I want to ask the audience, which Dave brought up when he first opened up, is there's no question there's been a great democratization of ad buying on the internet. I think that's about to change, and I have a bias about that. But I want to ask you, to Dave's point, which is more important? Is content important, or is it just audience? Okay, by that I mean this. So, I'm a male of a certain demographic. I myself go to many different sites, right? I signal my preferences with my behavior. I might go to National Geographic, I might go to the New York Times, I'll go to American Airlines, or I might go to a tennis site because I'm a tennis player, or I may even go to a pornography site, okay? So the question is, does it really matter where I am at any particular moment for an advertiser to target me and serve me? I believe it is important. I believe that content is important, that advertisers, there's been this great democratization, but over time they're going to want, American Express has multiple businesses. They have a DR business, but they also build brands. And they're not going to want over time to be on, and no matter how targetable that audience is, they're not going to want to be on certain sites. And they're going to repel from that at some point. That's what I believe. And it hasn't happened yet, but I believe over time that will happen. That's the tension between audience and context and content, I believe.
We've got a question over here.
Thanks, and this actually, I think, goes right into that. If I understood Alyssa correctly, it sounds like the information collection is a little siloed, that the ad people, whatever way, are taking information in one sense, and then the publishers may or may not be taking information from the other. Does anyone put those together? If I spend a lot of time looking at, the New York bomb suspect thing, and then buy pantyhose on a New York Times website, I'm making this up, is anyone putting those pieces together to look at my behavior to say what kind of content is conducive as an environment for ads, or are those still siloed in the way they seem to have been? And my second question, which may not be related, what role do browsers have in all this? Is Internet Explorer collecting behavioral information as well and using that in the back end, or is it agnostic about that? Or Firefox, or any of the others?
Alyssa, I think the second part's to you.
Yeah, so the browsers, generally speaking, are not collecting all this information, right? If they were, they would be sitting on a gold mine, right? Because it's not like when you go to that site and someone's serving you an ad, it's not like only that ad server can collect the information on the sites where it's serving something. The browser can collect everything because everywhere you go is through the browser. But for the most part, the browsers have not gotten into the game of sending information back to the mothership or building profiles about people. They've been more on the side of trying to provide controls to people who want to actually be able to control how much information is collected. And it's true
We've
for
spent a lot of
IE
time
and
talking,
Firefox
sorry.
and all of them.
We spent most of our time talking about advertising. We haven't touched on data at all, which is huge and emerging. And so just as publishers are having reaction and tension with the ad networks, so are we with data providers and other people. Anybody who puts a cookie on your site or a pixel on your site has the ability to begin using you for data aggregation. So to give you an example, there's a company called Quantcast, right? They started off as a internet, I don't even know if they,
as an
Aussie audience measurement company. So they come to us and said, do you mind if we put a pixel on your site? Well, what do you want it for? Well, we want to measure audience. Are you going to let it have your data? Yeah, sure. So if you go to Quantcast.com and you type in sfgate.com, you can see what our traffic is, right? Guess what? They have suddenly gone into the data business, and a very, very lucrative business selling that data to marketers. And so one of the tensions that's coming up is publishers are going to say, wait a minute, let's read our contract, all right? And I'm going to restrict your use of data, right? So that's going to be a growth industry for this room.
That's huge opportunity.
Yeah, and the pixel discussion, or the pixel point on Alyssa's presentation, I think is the most profound for this industry, because it's that pixel that triggers so many uses of consumer, data based off of the cookie, based off of what comes through the iframe. That's sort of the mother load. And pixels were generated originally to track conversions. When we started a lot of performance advertising, we had advertisers who came to us and said, I'm only going to pay you for the users that come and actually buy something on my site. We call that cost per action, CPA advertising. And in return for that, we're going to put your pixel on our thank you page, track that, and then every time that pixel fires, we will pay you $250 for that acquisition. That was sort of the genesis of it all. And then, everyone started saying, all right, well, with this pixel, now we can put them on publisher pages and start tracking usage there and creating behavioral profiles. But to come back to your question, I wasn't quite sure. Was the question, are we using all this behavioral data to create more personalized content for users? Was that?
You can use it to do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
That's one of the questions. Or to sell ads, to say, I
Yeah.
make my New York Times travel section, whatever, and use it a certain way. And it turns out that's a great environment for these kind of ads because you can spend a lot of time there, buy $2,000 worth of plane tickets within.
Yeah, and that's why.
That kind of thing.
And I think, the analytics point in Alyssa's presentation goes to that. A lot of these companies, like whether it's Omniture or Core Metrics or Web Trends or even the Quantcast of the world, sort of set themselves up to say, we're going to help you understand your audience and what they do. And it's the exact same technology that behavioral targeting utilizes as well. And so I think there is a slight connection there.
And because of the way the money came into the medium, there's been a lot of money put against those type of research companies.
Yeah.
But then Nielsen and ComScore, the two large rating services, the Arbitron and Radio, you got a handful of them. Not that they're not good businesses, their panel businesses are really good, or their custom research businesses are really good, but syndicated research doesn't pay all that well. So as a result, the publishers, I always felt like we were overpaying, but at the end of the day, given the size of panel that you need in order to accurately measure this medium, in order for advertisers to then allocate the dollars they should toward it, the panel measure systems that would bring the brand advertising into the medium aren't all that great. Everybody spent all this money on jamming pixels on everybody's page to try to get the next, South Beach diet buy or whatever it is that they're going after. And I think that until that gets straightened out, it's going to be a long, slow slog getting brand advertising. Companies like Matt's have an incredible wealth of information that they can start to go talk to advertisers about and convert them, but the normal publisher doesn't have that ability because the rating services underrepresent their audience a lot of times.
Now,
I think that there's one way where they do actually get married, which is where when the publisher is an advertiser. So you've seen, coming back to the airlines, for example, if you go to some airline sites and you get a couple steps into the process of buying a ticket, but then you don't buy, that airline can remember you, and then when you're on some other site and serves you an ad, cuts you a discount from the ad, right? So like Alaska Airlines does this. If you've gone to their site and almost purchased, but then didn't, when they turn themselves into an advertiser, they use that data to target you as, oh, we almost got this person to buy, but they actually didn't buy. So that's one place where there actually is kind of the crossover between the data collection on the publisher site and then the ad targeting.
And,
that's called retargeting.
Yeah, we call it remessaging, retargeting. It's a perfect example of sort of what we're up against, because the advertiser has a clear need. They say, okay, I've just spent all this money to get this person to my site. They abandoned, and I can now go find that person again. This is wonderful. This is mid-funnel targeting, and I will go remessage to them. But if you only do that with one publisher, you will find 5 people, maybe 10. And so I need to do that with literally thousands of publishers, and that's why you need third-party ad servers and networks to go do that. And it's just sort of the law of numbers. As you start targeting users way down, you need broad swaths of inventory, and you need to see broad numbers of users to be able to go find the cookies that you need to go get. And so that's the only answer we have to that need right now. If there's a way to accomplish that with full transparency and let the advertisers say, you know what, on these types of content sites, with this type of brand protection, I want to go after that, that's absolutely where we should go, but the needs are still there.
On that note, we're going to suspend this conversation. We're not going to end it. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to bring in the lawyers to give us some legal perspective. But while we're at it, could you help me thank Alyssa Cooper, Pam Horan, Dave Hills, Matt Carr, and Lincoln Milstein. Thank you.
Are you in Seattle?
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.